Labour's plans for Islamophobia, a definition of Islamophobia, sparking serious fears of censorship and special protections for one religion. It risks free speech and truthful reporting on Islamist extremism, it is claimed. In a moment, we'll speak to the national chairman of Labour, the Labour Muslim Network, Ali Milani, who's helped us out on this kind of stuff before. First, Fraser Myers, deputy editor of Spiked. Fraser, afternoon to you. This has been rumbling around for a while now. What's the latest on this? Where are we and what's the big fear?
So the latest is that the government has essentially called for a consultation on this. It wants various groups to feed into a definition. What's interesting is it's tend to ask mainly Muslim groups. It hasn't asked or invited any free speech groups, for instance, to take part in this discussion, even though the government claims it is aware that there are dangers to free speech and that it wants to get the balance right. The next phase, as well as this week, it will be there will be discussion with MPs and Lords in Parliament about where to go next with this definition.
The biggest criticism of this seems to be that you would end up with, there isn't a blasphemy law officially, but there is just one religion out there that does have a certain level of protection that other religions don't, or something like that, Fraser. Does that broadly appear to be the concern?
I think that's absolutely right. So any official definition, if it's adopted by the government, would be rolled out across the public sector, and we'd essentially have a kind of speech code against Islamophobia. Now, of course, you don't want officials in the government to hold prejudice towards Muslims and to say bigoted things. But the danger is when you're talking about Islam, that's a body of ideas. That's not a set of people. And in a free society, you should be allowed to criticize any set of ideas, and certainly religion. You know, people have fought very hard for criticize religion. The other danger is it's also not just the religion of Islam itself. So it looks likely that this definition will mirror an earlier definition that says that it is wrong to essentially criticize not just Muslims, but also Muslimness. And that's quite slippery, because it means then we're suddenly in the domain of where we can't criticize things that might be associated with Muslims, either rightly or wrongly, in the public mind. And if you look at this older definition from 2018, which seems certain to be replicated, and many of the same people are involved, it basically makes clear that you shouldn't say things like, you shouldn't talk about grooming gangs as having a particular prominence among Muslims, even though we know that there's a disproportion there. It says that historical facts like Islam subjugating people by the sword shouldn't be said, that could be racist. And of course, people will expect Islamist terrorism is talked about as as a stereotype and a trope, even though in reality, this is the biggest terror threat we face. And we need to be able to discuss those things openly, without fear or favour, without people fearing that they could lose their jobs or be accused of racism, because we've seen so many times in the past where that has actually led to serious problems down the line, whether it's the Manchester arena bombing, where a young security guard felt that he didn't want to say anything about a man with a giant rucksack because he would appear Islamophobic, to, of course, the grooming gang scandal, where the authorities were paralysed by a fear that they would appear racist. So we would think that we'd need to learn lessons from those scandals and not introduce new speech codes that will create a new climate of fear.
Is the problem, Fraser, and I just wonder this, that, and this probably gives the government too much credit, but is the thinking here that actually Muslims in this country have a very specific experience at the moment, and have done maybe for 10, 15 years in this country. It might have been the black population back in the 70s, but at the moment, when it comes, grooming gangs is one such contemporary example. We could talk clearly about political Islamism and terrorism, etc., disproportionality. What would happen if you suddenly say, right, we don't have any laws around this? It would encourage people, as some suggested during the Supreme Court gender announcement, that instead of people just going, oh, that's cleared that up, then it meant a whole lot of people could go, right, I can be really vile now to people who think they're born into the wrong body. Something like that might happen here. Is that what the government are thinking? Are they like just guarding themselves in case there's some kind of a horrendous onslaught against one group of people?
Yeah, I think there is obviously bigotry against Muslims in society, and you can understand that people would have entirely noble reasons for for wanting to push back against that. I think there are also some less noble motives coming from some groups who do simply want to shield criticism of Islam, criticism of their faith, criticism even of extreme Islamic practices, and they are able to they will be able to use essentially this definition for their benefit. So I actually don't doubt that Labour is sincere in wanting to challenge bigotry and hatred, but it's the way that it's going about it. It's going to create huge problems for free speech, and it's going to prevent the vital discussions that we need about some very serious challenges in society.
Listen, Fraser, great to have you on again. Thank you very much, Fraser Myers. He's deputy editor over there at Spiked. Ali Milani, waiting and listening to that, national chairman of the Labour Muslims Network. Ali, good afternoon to you, sir. You were hearing what Fraser said there. Just pick up from where he left off, if you like. Nice to have you with us, by the way.
Ian, thank you so much for having me on. It's good to join you. Listen, I think Fraser's done a remarkable job. I've never heard so many mistruths and misconceptions and distortions of the truth all in one 3-minute segment. So I take my hat off to him. It's quite impressive. First of all, let me make a couple of things clear for your listeners. It is absolutely not the intention of anybody involved, as that I have spoken to within the Muslim community, to introduce a blasphemy law or to outlaw criticisms of Islam. That's not what's happening here whatsoever. That's not the objective behind an Islamophobia definition. And very different to what Fraser has just said, the previous definition, it did not mean that you can't criticize Islam or even perceived Muslimness. That's absolute nonsense. In fact, all I would do is ask your listeners who have just heard what Fraser has said, which isn't true, to just go and read the previous APPG definition. What we are looking at doing is, look, don't listen to me. According to the Home Office's own data, violent and non-violent hate crime towards Muslims is the largest proportion of religiously motivated hate crime anywhere in the UK. And so in order for the government and various departments to deal with that kind of extremist hate towards Muslims, you have to define it. In the same way, I mean, look, I would suspect a lot of the criticisms of the Islamophobia definition aren't, will never and have never been levied towards definitions of anti-Semitism, for example, and other forms of bigotry. So all the objective here is to have a unified definition around the racism that Muslims experience according to the office's own data.
But is that not always, Ali, going to be a grey area? Just by definition, whether something is racist or whether it's satirical. I'm thinking, for some reason it went through my head there of Boris Johnson and the letterbox comment that he wrote years ago in The Telegraph. That was seen as being very unkind and unnecessary. He would have argued that if you read any of his columns, they all kind of did similar things in different ways. That's the sort of way he wrote. Would that be seen as blasphemous, or would that be seen as Islamophobic, I should say, if you were to say that, you got women walking around in these things looking a bit like letterboxes? Should I be allowed to say that?
Okay, so I'm glad you corrected the blasphemous and Islamophobia, because that we're not in any way walking towards a blasphemy law. What you've picked up is true. There will be grey areas, and that's why a definition is important, because there needs to be a benchmark for government and the various departments to measure it against. And this is, again, where Fraser is absolutely wrong, and it's not true, saying that it's only Muslims that have been involved in the evidence-gathering sessions and giving advice to this group. The public consultation is open to anybody. Fraser could right now log on to the public consultation and provide his view or Spiked's view on what this definition should look like. And that's what this conversation is all about. You're right. There'll be grey areas. We do not want to infringe on free speech. That is absolutely not the intention. That's why we're having a conversation around a definition and what it should look like. Now, on the specific example of Boris Johnson, I don't know if that would fall into Islamophobia. I mean, I have different critiques of Boris Johnson's writing. I mean, it's not good to begin with, and I think that particular example was unhelpful. And let me explain why. In the immediacy of Boris Johnson's comments around letterboxes and other things, we saw an enormous spike in religiously motivated hate crime towards Muslims, including Muslim women.
Did we really? I heard a colleague of mine say that the other day, and I just couldn't imagine a load of sort of octogenarian Telegraph readers rolling up their newspapers, running around the streets going, well, I've just heard what Boris said. I mean, for those of them who can walk, for goodness sake, I mean, we sort of hear that example whenever somebody says something contentious. It's like, oh, we saw a rise in it. I mean, it's said anecdotally. Is there any real proof of that?
Yeah, there was about a 500% increase.
So Boris's comment on that provoked a 500%.
Oh, no, we can't. Look, there was a 500% increase around that time. Now, can we directly link it to Boris Johnson's comments? I believe when politicians say things that are inflammatory, and look, I have my own belief that there are politicians in this country who are committed to blaming people that look, sound, and kind of primarily look different to us, to distract from the principal problems this country has. And it's a very lazy and dangerous form of politics where they don't have an answer to our problems. And so they want your listeners to hate Muslims, to hate black and brown people, because that's a distraction to the principal problems our country has. But can we link it directly to Boris's comments? No, there's no evidence to suggest that. But we also are clear that when politicians say things like this in public, then it emboldens a level of racism in our society, and the data suggests that. But one of the things, Ian, and I'm really pleased and grateful that you've had me on the show to be able to tell your listeners, from the Muslim community, and I have spoken to hundreds of Muslim organizations and leaders around the country, not a single instance have I heard any of these organizations or Muslim individuals looking to introduce blasphemy laws or to outlaw the criticisms of Islam. What we're looking at is a definition that gives Muslims the same rights Jewish people have, black people have, women have, for example, when it comes to misogyny, and that's to define their own experiences of racism and give the government a definition to work towards and to work with.
Is there always going to be, I mean, look, when people talk about religion of any type, you sort of kind of slightly end up in Monty Python territory. You know, I made a comment about going to a big church recently, and the vicar that was doing the ceremony, you know, I had the best dress in the congregation. So that was a sort of I don't know if that was a letterbox comment, but about a Christian man who looked he was wearing a dress. I don't know. But the fact is, we will always look at, you know, any area that has cultural differences will always be ripe for satire, if nothing else, or parody. So that in itself is, I suppose, the grey area, isn't it? You know, what is, you know, you could make a comment about a burqa or a vicar's dress, etc. You could do that satirically. You could do that within the confines of, you know, trying to make a wider observation. It's funny, isn't it? It's the 21st century. You've got people walking around with their face covered up. You know, I think you should be allowed to say that.
Look, satire is a historic part of British tradition and comedy and culture. And again, it's not in the intention of any of us working on a definition to stamp down on that. But what you can't do, for example, is attack Muslims or on their Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. This is where it's important that we recognize the racism that's involved in the kind of bigotry and hatred that Muslims experience in this country. I'll give you an example. If I or anyone on the street gets approached and gets called a terrorist, for example, which is a common slur that Muslims experience in the public, no, not once have I heard the person doing this, first of all, stopping you, asking you, are you Muslim? Have you Shahada? And then proceeding to racially abuse you. They do it based on what you look like and your perceived Muslimness. That is why the very first person who died as a result of an Islamophobic attack after 9/11 was a Sikh man, because there was a perception that he was Muslim. And so there is a huge element of racism that underpinned this. And that's why Fraser so wrongly and completely distorted the previous definition around Muslimness and perceived Muslimness, because it is so often the color of your skin, the way you sound, and the way that you look why you receive that level of hatred. So no, it's not so much going after satire and that sort of thing. But what you can't do, for example, as a Muslim politician in this country, you can't just associate me, for example, with terrorism or grooming gangs or what's going on in Iran or Afghanistan and Iraq. That would be racism, and that's what the definition would cover.
I get that, and for what it's worth, just to throw this in, you mentioned the Sikh guy, a friend of mine who happens to be just a slightly dark, sort of your coloured skin, white man who's been called the P word more times than he can remember on the basis that he looks a little bit brown, which is, you know, again, that moves into the dark territory that you're referring to. And if you're walking around and you are obviously, in this case, Muslim, and people are shouting that out, which is not, you know, only likely to be an inaccuracy, it could be all sorts of, you know, and clearly demonstrably racist and offensive. But that is already illegal, that stuff, isn't it? So you don't need any new laws to cover that. So if, you know, somebody shouts that word at you, that's an arrestable offence.
Yeah, and so the definition is actually about it's actually about the conversation we've been having. It's about this grey area. It's to give departments and government what is and isn't, because a lot of times we're asking people who don't directly experience Islamophobia to define it and to help measure complaints against it. We need to give something to support them on that, and that's all this consultation and process is. Hopefully, we reach an end point where we have a proper Islamophobia definition, where the term Islamophobia is used and the racism that underpins it is recognized, and then we can all move on. And that's all Muslims are asking for. And this is where Fraser doesn't get it and others don't get it.
All right.
Muslims simply asking to define their own experiences of racism the same way other communities are.
Ali, thank you very much, as ever. Ali Milani, National Chair of the Labour Muslim Network. Thank you to him. You could just stick with the racism rules that are in place. I would imagine it's deeply unpleasant if somebody picks up on what you're wearing or, you know, your skin colour, etc.